You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
One summer afternoon, a French farmer stood at his kitchen door, watching in fear as his dog ran in manic circles around his barnyard. The normally gentle animal had gone insane. Every time the farmer tried to grab him by the collar, the dog snapped at him and then went back to running in its crazy circles. But suddenly, the dog stopped running. He sniffed at the ground, then bit down on a rock and chewed on it so hard his mouth started to bleed. Nothing the farmer did could get him to stop. The dog just kept chewing on more and more rocks until blood was running down his mouth and his teeth were starting to fall out. What the farmer couldn't know as he watched his beloved dog go crazy was that only 2 days later, he, the farmer, would be the one running around that same yard, screaming incoherently like a madman. It was an inexplicable horror that would spread throughout the entire village, and no one would know how to stop it. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please sign the follow button up for karaoke in the Philippines and put them down for the song My Way by Frank Sinatra. This week's story is called Tigers on the Ceiling. On a hot Friday afternoon in August of 1951, Dr. Albert Gabay drove his car through the narrow streets of a village in the south of France. He had just spent a relaxing week with his family in the Pyrenees, which is a mountain range that runs along the border between France and Spain. His wife and 4 kids were still at their mountain cabin, enjoying their vacation, but Dr. Gabay had to reopen his office and return to work. Now, after a long drive, he was finally back in his hometown of Pont St. Esprit. His route took him along a street that had been heavily bombed during World War II. He drove past gray stone buildings that stood next to piles of stone rubble. In the distance, he could see the Rhone River sparkling in the afternoon sun. He turned a corner and spotted his friend, the grocer, who stood in the doorway of his store greeting customers. Dr. Gabay waved hello through his car window and continued on his way. Further into town, he slowed to a stop so that the baker could carry sacks of flour across the street. Dr. Gabay loved this town, where he had lived his entire life. Pont St. Esprit was small enough that there were only 2 other doctors besides him who worked there. It was a friendly place where everyone seemed to know each other. Not long ago, Dr. Gabay had wondered if he'd be forced to leave Pont St. Esprit. During World War II, the village was occupied by the German army. Then Allied forces sent in warplanes to bomb the German troops. It was a terrifying ordeal, and the recovery had been slow, but the doctor was optimistic that the village would one day be fully restored to its former glory. The sun was low in the sky when Dr. Gabay turned into a small courtyard and parked his car. His home and medical office shared a stone building in the center of the village. As he carried his suitcase towards the front door, Dr. Gabay was looking forward to eating a simple dinner and getting to bed early. But when he opened the door, his housekeeper, who had arrived earlier to tidy up, rushed to greet him with a concerned look on her face. Before she could say anything, Dr. Gabay stopped in surprise. The waiting room of his first-floor office was jammed full of people. The small room had a dozen wood chairs pushed up against the walls, and every seat was filled. Old men leaned their heads back against the wall with their eyes closed. Some mothers held children in their laps, and other children were sprawled on the floor. Dr. Gabay recognized one entire family. Everyone looked clammy and pale. He took a breath and frowned. The room had a sharp and unpleasant odor. His housekeeper explained that over the last few hours, sick people kept showing up asking to see him. She told them that she wasn't sure what time he would return, but they decided to wait for him anyway. There was clearly something going around in the village, and Dr. Gabay wanted to be sure he wasn't dealing with a serious outbreak. Dinner would have to wait. Dr. Gabay headed for the exam room and told his housekeeper to send in the first patient. Over the next several hours, Dr. Gabai examined them one by one. Their complaints were identical: upset stomach, nausea, and chills. And so it seemed very likely that they all had mild cases of food poisoning. Dr. Gabai thought it was odd that so many people got hit with it at once, but he was sure there was a reasonable explanation for that. There had been a lot of problems with the food supply as France struggled to recover from the war, so it wasn't unusual for people to come down with food poisoning every once in a while. The treatment for it was simple. Most people just needed a few days' rest to make a full recovery. Dr. Gabai gave the patients some medicine to settle their stomachs and assured them that they would feel better soon. It would take several hours to get to every single patient, but when the last one had left his office, Dr. Gabai slowly made his way up the stairs to finally eat his dinner. He called his wife to explain what was going on, and after he was done reassuring her, he climbed right into bed and fell asleep. At 11 o'clock the next morning, Dr. Gabai was standing in the kitchen of a farmhouse with the family who lived there. Half of the family had been sick in his waiting room the evening before. Dr. Gabai didn't usually work on Saturdays, but he thought it would be good to check in on some of the patients he had seen. This was his second house call of the morning. He had looked over the family members one by one, and he was now examining a skinny boy dressed in a nightshirt. The boy said he felt better today, and Dr. Gabai smiled. He was glad that most of his patients seemed to be doing better. But something didn't feel quite right to Dr. Gabai. Even before he stopped in to see this boy and his family, he had started to wonder if something other than food poisoning was troubling the residents of Pont St. Esprit. For one thing, he had questioned all of the patients, but he still hadn't figured out what they had all eaten that could have made them all sick. But there was another thing Dr. Gabai noticed that was even stranger. The farmhouse's kitchen had an incredibly unpleasant odor. It was the same one that had filled his waiting room the day before. It took a while before the doctor could put his finger on where he had smelled it before. It was years ago, in his own house. Some mice had been living inside his bedroom wall, but then the mice died, and it took several days for the smell of decay to go away. That dead mouse odor, like a mixture of rotten cabbage and sulfur, was what he was smelling when he was around some of his patients. This farmhouse, like all of the houses he visited that morning, was clean. Its windows were open, and the smell of warm bread from the nearby bakery was coming in with the summer breeze. There was no evidence of mice anywhere. But for the moment, Dr. Gabai didn't have time to think about it too much. Just before noon, after finishing his house calls, the weary doctor returned to his office, and his waiting room was full again. All the patients were again showing signs of food poisoning, and all had that same horrible smell. Whatever had happened was clearly not an isolated event. Dr. Gabai had to get to the bottom of it before things got out of hand. At 11 o'clock that night, Dr. Gabai was still in his office doing paperwork when there was a knock on his door. He opened it to find one of the other doctors in the village standing there. His name was Dr. Vieux, and he looked completely exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes. Dr. Vieux told him that he had also seen a lot of patients with symptoms of food poisoning while Dr. Gabai was away on vacation, and that the number of patients had begun to rise the day before Dr. Gabai came back to town. Dr. Gabai sighed and rubbed his temples. Unfortunately, the third doctor in the village was sick with the illness going around town and couldn't get out of bed. And so it was up to Dr. Vieux and Dr. Gabai to handle whatever was happening. The two doctors could only handle so much. If more people got sick, they might not be able to take care of them all. The two doctors started to compare notes. Dr. Vieux had also noticed that a lot of his patients were emitting the same awful odor of dead mice that Dr. Gabai had smelled, and Dr. Vieux was just as mystified. On top of that, over the course of the day, both doctors had noted that some of their patients had symptoms that were so bizarre they didn't know how to start treating them. Their skin was growing pale, their pupils were dilated, and they struggled to keep their minds focused. It was so bad that several of them said they were no longer able to read. Whatever this disease was, it wasn't normal food poisoning. As the doctors wrapped up their meeting, they realized that between them, they had seen at least 230 patients in the last few days. In a town with a population of just 4,000, that was a huge number. They agreed that it was time to notify the authorities since the situation could stretch the town's resources. Before leaving, Dr. View stopped in the doorway and made a confession. He wasn't feeling well himself and wondered if he was coming down with the same illness as everyone else. As Dr. Gabai closed the door, he tried to stay calm and keep focused on the facts. He was relieved that he didn't feel sick, he just felt tired. But a medical crisis was clearly emerging in Pont St. Esprit, and now it looked like Dr. Gabai might be the only doctor healthy enough to handle it. With those heavy thoughts weighing on him, at 2 a.m, Dr. Gabai sat back down at his desk to catch up on his notes. Not long after, the phone rang. It was the wife of a local farmer named Felix Meissen. Dr. Gabai had made a visit to their home earlier on Saturday when he was making house calls. Felix's condition seemed to be improving, but now he could hear panic in the voice of Felix's wife. She said that Felix could hardly breathe or talk, and that he was acting like a madman. Within minutes, Dr. Gabai was in his car, speeding through dark country roads towards the farmhouse. Felix's wife met him at the door. She said that shortly after Dr. Gabai left their house on Saturday, Felix suddenly jumped up out of bed and ran out into the yard. Then he burst back in and rolled back and forth on his bed, screaming at the top of his lungs. Now, 12 hours later, he was curled up in a ball on the mattress, struggling to breathe. Dr. Gabai went immediately to the bedside to examine him. Felix was lying motionless, his breathing loud and ragged. He seemed barely conscious and didn't respond when Dr. Gabai spoke to him. His pupils were dilated and his temperature was low. Dr. Gabai worried that Felix's heart was going to give out if he didn't get treatment as soon as possible. The closest hospital that could handle this kind of emergency was an hour's drive south in a city called Nîmes. Dr. Gabai called for an ambulance and then tended to Felix while they waited for it to arrive. The doctor was grasping for any clue he could find, so he asked Felix's wife what they had eaten in the past few days. Just what they always ate, she said, summer stew, bread, cheese, and wine. But then she recalled that something terrible had happened at their house 2 days ago. They found their dog running in circles outside. Before they knew it, the dog was chewing on rocks until blood began pouring out of its mouth. Minutes later, their beloved pet went into convulsions and died. Dr. Gabai thought it was very possible that the dog's death was connected to the same illness that Felix and the others were all suffering from. If that was the case, the situation was even more serious than he thought. If the dog died, then people could die as well. The leaders of Pont St. Esprit needed to be alerted to the danger as soon as possible. That evening, Dr. Gabai sat in a crowded and stuffy room in the town hall where a heated discussion was underway. It was Sunday now, and earlier that day, he had convinced the mayor to call an emergency meeting about this strange medical crisis with the municipal council, the police chief, and other city officials. But so far, everyone was just arguing. Dr. Gabai was frustrated. There were now at least 280 people affected with this bizarre and now potentially lethal illness, and he was at his limit. Dr. Gabai had been working almost non-stop with very little sleep since he returned from his vacation over 48 hours ago. His eyes burned with fatigue and his temper rose, so he stood up and made sure his voice was strong, and he told everyone they needed to alert the town to the danger. The mayor placed a hand on his shoulder. He was just as concerned as Dr. Gabai, but scientists and medical experts from nearby universities had been summoned to study the problem, and the remains of Felix Meissen's dog would be sent to the lab to be analyzed. The mayor felt the best course was to gather that data and then figure out what to tell the townspeople. Anything else would make everyone more panicked. Dr. Gabai grew even more impatient. He insisted that their analysis would take too much time. The danger was already here, and people needed to be warned now so they could protect themselves. But the mayor held his ground. What would they warn people about exactly? They still didn't even know what was causing the trouble. At this point, the mayor thought the so-called crisis consisted of a dead dog and multiple people with a stomach flu. And there was no proof that the two were even related. But there was one precaution that the mayor did want to take right away. Before adjourning the meeting, the mayor turned to the police chief. Given the number of people afflicted with the illness, they couldn't rule out the possibility that someone was deliberately poisoning the village. The police chief agreed to launch a criminal investigation right away, but he would need assistance from law enforcement officials in neighboring cities. The meeting ended at 1 a.m., and Dr. Gabay started walking home, exhausted and frustrated. A criminal investigation seemed like a total waste of time to him. After all, why would anyone be launching such a vicious attack on their tiny and somewhat insignificant town? But then, the more he thought about it, the doctor supposed that a criminal motive could not really be ruled out. All he knew was that he needed to get home and sleep if he was going to be of any help to his patients the next day. But just as he entered the courtyard in front of his home, he heard high-pitched shrieks coming from the nearby grocery store. Dr. Gabay ran down the street to the store and pounded on the door. The grocer's wife was relieved to see him and brought him up the stairs to the family's apartment and into her daughter's room. There, on her bed, 5-year-old Marie-Joseph Karl was writhing in agony. Her arms and legs were jerking, her fingers and toes clenched so tightly that they were white and bloodless. The doctor hurried to the child's side and tried to pry her toes open. In their rigid position, it was impossible for blood to flow properly, and her feet could be permanently damaged. Suddenly, Marie-Joseph sat upright, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed at the air in front of her and screamed that tigers were coming to eat her. Dr. Gabay enlisted the mother's help to restrain the child, and then he gave Marie-Joseph a shot of a sedative that he hoped would calm her down. The doctor rubbed his eyes and told the weeping mother that Marie-Joseph had to be treated in a hospital and that he needed to call an ambulance. Dr. Gabay then walked down the hallway towards the kitchen where the phone was located, but as he stepped past the parents' bedroom, he stopped. There, inside the room, was the grocer, Mr. Karl, sitting up on his elbows in bed as he stared out the window. The doctor was confused as to why Mr. Karl wasn't tending to his daughter. The grocer seemed strangely preoccupied and disturbed. When Dr. Gabay stepped closer to him, he realized the grocer wasn't staring out the window, he was just staring at it. As if in a trance, Mr. Karl held up his finger and softly counted the 6 panes embedded in the window. He repeated the numbers over and over and over again. Dr. Gabay sniffed the air and detected that familiar smell of dead mice. It could only mean one thing, that Mr. Karl had fallen ill as well. After making sure Mr. Karl was comfortable, Dr. Gabay returned to Marie-Joseph's bedroom. He expected her to be groggy from the sedative, maybe even asleep. Instead, he found the child alert and happy, as if she had been fully cured. The child looked at the doctor and smiled and told him that the tigers must have been a dream. The doctor checked her temperature and her pulse. She was totally back to normal. Instead of putting Marie-Joseph to sleep, the sedative appeared to have completely cured her. Dr. Gabay shook his head. None of this made any sense. He decided to hold off calling the ambulance, thinking Marie-Joseph could now fully recover at home. It was nearly dawn when Dr. Gabay said goodnight to the Karl family and staggered back to his house. As he opened his door, the phone was ringing. It was the hospital in Nîmes. Felix Meissen, the farmer, was dead. Whatever illness was attacking the town of Pont St. Esprit, it was fatal. This had officially turned into a full-blown medical catastrophe. Later that morning, a wave of law enforcement officers swept into Pont St. Esprit. They stopped people on the street to ask questions, they interrogated shopkeepers, and closed some shops entirely. The presence of so many police officers alarmed people, and gossip began to fly around the village. Every person knew someone who was sick. Some people speculated that perhaps the rumors were true, and a madman or killer was poisoning the village. Maybe he poisoned the water, or perhaps the salt or the meat or some other food. Some people quietly packed and left town. By the end of the day, the once bustling center of the village was growing empty and quiet. Dr. Gabay watched families leaving from the door of his house. He thought of his own wife and kids who were still on vacation in the mountains. He'd spoken to them briefly at the start of this sickness, but he wanted to check in on them again. So he placed a phone call to the vacation house. His wife was shocked when he updated her about the terrifying events unfolding in their town. She worried that her husband would wear himself out or get the awful illness himself. Dr. Gabay told his wife that he was fine, and he believed that she and their kids were safe since they were out of town. However, he had a duty to continue to treat the people of his village. Dr. Gabay hung up the phone. The next day was Tuesday, 4 days since he had come home from vacation. By mid-morning, the delegation of university doctors and scientists had arrived. They collected food scraps and sent them out to be analyzed by a scientific laboratory to test for poison. And then they ordered an autopsy to be performed on Felix Meissen. Dr. Gabay tried to reassure his patients that they'd have answers soon. But in private, he worried about how long it was taking. It would be several days at least before the test results came back and the autopsy was complete. He couldn't stand the thought of more people dying as they waited. Not only that, but Dr. Gabay didn't know how long he could continue to work without rest, and there was still the possibility that he would get sick himself. As the weeks wore on with still no news about the tests or the autopsy, Dr. Gabay saw dozens of patients in his office and crisscrossed the streets to visit the sicker patients at home. His phone rang every night with news of more strange symptoms emerging. Now, many of his patients seemed irrationally happy. They talked so quickly that it was impossible to understand them. But then, just as fast as the euphoria emerged, it would come crashing down, leaving the patients overcome with anguish. And then there were the patients who just couldn't sleep. Instead, they would gather in the street in the middle of the night. Dr. Gabay could hear them from his window, chatting and laughing with a strange, frenetic energy. Others he could see wandering aimlessly through the dark streets, silent and lost. It was as if Pont St. Esprit had become haunted and cursed. The village priest prayed to saints to lift the curse from the town. Dr. Gabay wasn't superstitious, but it made him remember a disease he had read about many years before. It was called St. Anthony's Fire, a sickness that happened back in the Middle Ages and caused entire villages to go mad, just like he was seeing in Pont St. Esprit. Back then, many people believed that it was a curse from the devil. Dr. Gabay was a man of science, but he wondered if there could be a connection. At this point, a supernatural explanation from the 15th century was as good as any other. Dr. Gabay shook his head. This was modern France, and medicine didn't operate on hunches. The most pressing thing right now was for the toxicology lab to finish its work. In the meantime, he would continue to treat his patients as well as he could, and he would look up old diseases once he had some free time. He hoped this would be soon. Once the lab had an answer, he would know how to treat the disease, everyone would get better, and he would have enough time to pursue his hunches. Instead, he'd find out things could still get much, much worse. It was Friday evening, just 1 week since Dr. Gabay had returned from his vacation. He was in his car following an ambulance that carried little Marie Joseph Carl. Her delirious visions of tigers had returned, and she had become so violent that her mother had to tie her to the bed. Dr. Gabay had watched helplessly as the 5-year-old was loaded into an ambulance, kicking and screaming. As he parked his car in front of the old hospital in Pont St. Esprit, he noticed that every light in the building was blazing. As he walked to the entrance, Dr. Gabay saw a man appear in a second-floor window, waving his arms wildly. And then, to Dr. Gabay's horror, the man climbed out the window and stood on the ledge. 2 nurses quickly crept up behind him, begging him to get back in the room, but every time they reached out, the man smacked their hands away. Then the man stretched out his arms and proclaimed that he was an airplane and that he could fly, and then he jumped. He landed with his feet on the pavement, and immediately there was this deafening crack as both of his legs snapped in half. The man screamed in agony as he lay on his back. But suddenly, the man's energy shifted. It was as if he pushed the pain right out of his body and replaced it with intense anger. Somehow, the man with the 2 broken legs rose up and then took off running full speed down the boulevard. Dr. Gabay couldn't believe what he was seeing. How could anyone run on 2 totally broken legs? And this was only the beginning of the night that seemed to Dr. Gabay like an apocalypse. He entered the hospital to find the wards packed full of screaming, struggling patients. His patients who had seemed to be getting better were now totally psychotic. Many screamed that their hands and feet were on fire. Some fought desperately against imaginary enemies in the air. The odor of dead mice was now overwhelming. Dr. Gabai was on the brink of collapse. He started to wonder if he himself had gotten sick. Was he hallucinating or going crazy? Dr. Gabai considered whether he should just give up and finally get the sleep he so desperately needed. But ultimately, he knew that quitting was a violation of his oath as a doctor, and the residents of Pont St. Esprit were counting on him, so he chose to soldier on. He put out an order that Marie Joseph be sent to another hospital 30 miles away in Avignon, where he hoped it would be calmer. Then he tried injecting some of the victims with sedatives, hoping to quiet them since it had worked before with Marie Joseph. But the sedatives had absolutely no effect on their ferocious behavior. The strength and violence of the patients was beyond belief. They were dangerous to themselves and to everyone around them. One patient sprung up from his bed, punching and kicking at everyone around him. It took 14 men to hold him down. While that was happening, several other patients broke away from their rooms and tried to jump out windows or run through walls. Dr. Gabai saw no option but to immobilize patients in straitjackets and send them to be locked up in a psychiatric hospital. But then the hospital ran out of straitjackets. Nurses tied patients to their beds with ropes and twine, where they lay screaming in horror. When they ran out of rope, the nurses used horses' reins. But the restraints didn't hold. One by one, victims broke away and ran back out into the hospital garden, where they uprooted tomato stakes and wielded them like swords against each other. Dr. Gabai worked through the night trying to treat the injuries that patients had inflicted on themselves. One of these patients was the man who had leapt out of the window and broken both of his legs. It took 8 men to hold him down as Dr. Gabai set his fractures. As he worked, Dr. Gabai noticed that the man's toes were rigid and bluish green. Over the course of this long and horrible night, it seemed like every patient he had seen had toes and fingers that were stiff and lifeless. Dr. Gabai paused as the screaming and mayhem continued all around him. He thought of Marie Joseph's rigid hands and feet. He thought of the terrible smell that reminded him of dead mice. He thought again of the Middle Ages and the curse of St. Anthony's fire. And then a picture started to come into focus in his mind. He would need the lab results to prove it, but he believed he had just figured out what was causing this horrific sickness, and it tied all the way back to the medieval plague of St. Anthony's fire. It took several days for Dr. Gabai and the medical investigators to fully uncover the truth, but they discovered that it had all started in an unassuming shop in the center of Pont St. Esprit. At noon on Thursday, August 16th, the day before Dr. Gabai returned from vacation, the village baker, Roche-Brion, completed the third and last batch of bread of the day. Roche had been a baker in Pont St. Esprit for 30 years. Every household in the village bought at least one fresh loaf of bread every day, and many thought that Roche's bread was the best in town. However, on that day, August 16th, Roche was not pleased with the quality of his product. As he kneaded the dough, he noticed that the color was slightly gray. There had been complaints about the bread recently. He blamed the flour, which had been delivered to him by the government agency that supplied flour to bakeries all over France. Ever since the war, the flour had been of bad quality. It was usually wheat flour mixed with flour made from rye grain and dried beans. Sometimes it even contained dust and insects. That day he was making the bread, the baker knew that the dough just seemed a little off. Still, every time he tasted it, he thought it tasted fine. So he baked the bread, put it out for sale, and decided he'd lodge a protest with the flour suppliers the next morning. All day Thursday, people streamed into his shop for their bread, and again all day Friday and Saturday. Before dawn on Sunday, Roche and his wife were feeling a little nauseous, but they decided to take an overnight trip to see their kids who were spending the summer out of town. When Roche and his wife returned to Pont St. Esprit on Monday, the epidemic was in full swing. His bakery had been closed by the police, and Roche's wife was now so ill that she went straight to bed. When the police concluded their investigations, they confirmed that everyone who got sick had bought bread from Roche's bakery. What Roche didn't know was that a portion of the rye grain that was used by the government to dilute the flour was bad. It had gotten damp in the field and a fungus had grown on it. That fungus had been ground up with the rest of the grain as it was turned into flour, and this flour ended up in a sack that was delivered to Roche's bakery to use for making his bread. This fungus was incredibly resilient. It not only survived being ground into flour, it also survived the high heat of Roche's bakery oven. It lay dormant in the crusty brown loaves Roche sold to his customers, and then when Roche's customers ate their bread, this fungus entered their bodies. The fungus caused their stomachs to cramp, made it impossible to sleep, and caused people to feel like their hands and feet were burning. It also triggered hallucinations of tigers and airplanes and flying. It even made dogs turn on their owners and think that rocks were food. In fact, it had affected all sorts of animals, including pigs, ducks, and cats. All of these bizarre responses were triggered by chemicals in the fungus. One of these chemicals was lysergic acid, from which lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD, is made. LSD is a very powerful hallucinogen. On top of all of this, when people ate the fungus, it set off a response in their bodies that cut off circulation to their limbs. The terrible stink that reminded Dr. Gabay of dead mice was actually the smell of his patient's fingers and toes slowly rotting with gangrene. This gangrene was well known in the Middle Ages when it was a symptom of the plague known as St. Anthony's Fire. Now, hundreds of years later, in 1951, this same plague was running rampant through the village of Pont St. Esprit long after the disease had passed out of memory. The fungus was known as ergot, and the illness it caused was known to modern medicine as ergotism. Ultimately, 7 people died and nearly 300 people were sickened in the ergotism outbreak in Pont St. Esprit. It took several months for the disease to run its course. Most patients slowly got better and were able to resume their normal lives. The baker, Roche, was at first suspected of intentionally poisoning the village, but was later found to be blameless. The memory of the 1951 poisoning still haunts the village. The official investigations went on for years. Finally, it was agreed that the people of Pont St. Esprit had indeed been under the influence of some kind of hallucinatory substance contained in the flour. How the substance got into the flour remains under debate to this day. Was written by Heather Dundas and edited by Alex Benedon. Sound design is by Andre Plus. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Natalie Bettendorf. Fact-checking was done by Jacqueline Coletti. For Ballen's Studios, our producer is Alyssa Tomanang. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our head of sound is Marcelino Villalpando. Our producer is Julie Magruder. Senior producers are Loredana Polivoda, Dave Schilling, and Matt Olmos. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louie for Wondery.
On February 2nd, 2012, a young man pulled off a 4-lane highway in Anchorage, Alaska, into a large, snowy parking lot. He passed by dozens of parked cars until he arrived in front of this small shack that was brightly teal-colored. It was a popular coffee shop called the Common Grounds, and this young man worked as a barista there. After he parked his car, he walked up to the white door employee entrance to this little building, and he got his key out and he went to unlock the door, but when he turned the key, he saw the door was already unlocked. He He knew the girl who had worked the previous night and would have been responsible for locking the shop up. She was 18-year-old Samantha Koenig, and although she had only been on the job for about a month, she seemed very responsible and had never had any issues closing up before. The young man shrugged it off though. He figured people make mistakes, and he went inside. Right away, he noticed that a couple of things just seemed out of place. It was like Samantha must have just left in the middle of her shift without even attempting to clean up. There were napkins on the ground, there were towels out, there were cups still out. And so as this young man is walking over to the cash register to unlock it, he's running through scenarios in his head about how Samantha could have been so sloppy. And then he reached down with his register key, and just like the door, the cash register was already unlocked. When he pulled the tray out, all the money was gone. And that's when he knew they had been robbed. And so he called his boss. The night before, Samantha had asked her boyfriend, Dwayne, to pick her up after her shift at the Common Grounds. Dwayne arrived in front of the kiosk at about 8:30 p.m., which was 30 minutes after her shift should have been over. Dwayne had gotten held up at his job, which is why he was late. And so when he gets there, Dwayne looks around the parking lot and he doesn't see Samantha anywhere. He sees the coffee shop itself is totally dark and looks like it's been closed up for the night. And so Dwayne gets out of his truck into the freezing cold night air, and he walked up to the window of this coffee shop and he pressed his face up to the glass to look inside, but there was nobody in there. Dwayne automatically went back to the fight he had gotten into with Samantha earlier in the night via text message. She had accused him of cheating on her. He had been kind of nonchalant, like he didn't care about it, and what ensued was a really ugly fight. And so as Dwayne is walking back to his truck, he's thinking to himself, maybe Samantha just didn't want to see him because of the fight, and so at the end of her shift, she got a ride home from her father or maybe from a friend, and that's why she's not here. And so Dwayne gets back inside of his truck and he sends a text message to Samantha asking if she's okay, if she's gotten home, but after several minutes of no response from her, Dwayne, even though they were fighting, he still cares an awful lot about his girlfriend. He decides, I gotta go by her house and make sure she's there and that she's okay. And so a couple minutes later, he gets to her house, he goes up to the door, and her single father, James, answers the door. Dwayne explains that he didn't see Samantha after her shift and just wanted to make sure she was here, but James says, she's not here. I have no idea where she is. I haven't spoken to her. And so the two men go into James's kitchen, they sit down, and they start texting and calling Samantha to try to figure out where she is. And after a couple of minutes, Dwayne's phone lights up and it's a text message from Samantha. And the message clearly indicates that she's still very upset with Dwayne, but she's saying that she needs some time to think and that she's going to be with some friends for a couple of days, and would he, Dwayne, let her father know where she was. And so Dwayne shows James the text message, and Samantha's father looks at it and he's thinking to himself, this is very uncharacteristic of Samantha. He had raised Samantha since she was 2 years old, and they were very close. They shared everything with each other. It didn't make any sense that she wouldn't contact him directly to say that she was going to be out with friends for a couple of days. And it didn't make sense that she would ignore all of his phone calls and text messages when clearly he was worried about her. The two men stayed up super late, calling and texting, hoping to get more information from Samantha, but she never responded. She never texted back. And so the following morning, when neither man had gotten any more messages from Samantha, James went to the Anchorage Police Department and filed a missing person report for his only daughter. After receiving this missing person report, an officer with the Anchorage Police Department called the owner of the Common Grounds coffee shop to ask about Samantha. And the owner actually said they just got a call from their barista that was working at the kiosk that morning, and they had informed them that apparently there had been a robbery and no one can get in touch with Samantha. No one knows where she is. The owner told the police officer that as soon as she got her hands on the security footage from the night before, she would send it over to the police department. While the police waited for this footage, some officers began calling Samantha's friends and other family members to see if they knew where she was, but no one had heard from her and no one knew where she was. No one had any information. Some other police officers headed over to the Common Grounds coffee kiosk to get a look at it for themselves. And when they got there was no sign of a struggle outside or inside the kiosk, and inside, underneath the counter, was a panic button that had not been pressed. And so even though Samantha's father thought there was something odd about her final text message, the police began operating under the theory that Samantha had robbed the kiosk and then left of her own accord. But what confounded police was how Samantha actually physically got away from the coffee shop. She didn't have a car that night, and she couldn't have just walked away because the weather was way too miserable and cold outside, and Anchorage is just not really a walkable city. And so if Samantha was telling the truth, that that she was just taking a couple of days to be by herself with some friends at their place, then why didn't any of her friends know where she was? This question was answered later that day when the owner of the coffee shop made the security footage available. The footage, which has no audio, picks up around 8 p.m. on February 1st, 2012, which was the night Samantha went missing. It shows Samantha inside of the kiosk. She's working alone, she's cheerful, and she's busy. And then at some point, someone that we can't see, they're outside of the camera's range, comes up to the window and orders a drink. Samantha clearly turns to them, acknowledges their drink order, and turns and begins making this drink. And then after she's done making it, she turns to give it to this person, and immediately Samantha steps back and puts her arms up. And then seconds later, she reaches over and turns off the lights inside of the kiosk, and then she gets down on her knees with her back to the window. She stays in that position, not talking, not moving, for about a minute before she slowly stands up and walks down the kiosk towards the cash register. She opens it up, she scoops some money out of it, then she walks back to the window and appears to hand it to a shadowy figure on the other side of the window, and then Samantha turns, kneels again with her back to the window. 2 more minutes go by before this person outside the window leans their entire upper body inside of the coffee shop. They reach down and they appear to tie Samantha's hands. Now, because it was dark inside of the kiosk, the footage winds up being extremely grainy, and there's no way to identify who this figure is. Although it's fairly obvious that it's a male. He's wearing a big sweatshirt and he's got a hat pulled down low over his face. After this mystery man is done tying Samantha's hands, he leaps through the window and then shuts the window behind him. And then he stands Samantha up, he puts a gun into her back, and then he marches her out the employee door and then out across the lot, all the way to a white pickup truck where he puts her inside and they drive off. Over the next couple of days, the police and also the FBI, who had been called in to be a part of this investigation, they just kept hitting dead end after dead end because there was no evidence. All they had was this surveillance footage that was too grainy to tell who this guy was that took Samantha. Meanwhile, Samantha's father, James, had rallied the support of nearly all 300,000 people that lived in Anchorage to go out and look for his daughter. His efforts were so profound, it had attracted major news outlets across the country, and suddenly his daughter's story had grabbed national headlines everywhere. This led to strangers donating thousands of dollars to fund a reward for anybody that had information about Samantha's whereabouts. But despite this reward growing in size every single day, and the national news media becoming increasingly more interested in this case, no one came forward with useful information that led to developments in this case, and Samantha never got in touch with Dwayne or her father. Then on February 24th, so 3 weeks after Samantha's gone missing and no one's heard from her, Dwayne got a text message from Samantha's phone, and it was directing him to a particular sign inside of a nearby public park. And so Dwayne and James read this text, they shared it with the police department, and then they raced to this park and actually beat the police there by about 15 minutes. And so Dwayne and James, they walk through the gates and they start walking down this main trail, and they stop in front of this sign. It was actually a bulletin board, and tacked on the bulletin board was a Ziploc bag inside of which was a typed ransom note, and on the ransom note, literally Xeroxed onto it, was a black and white photo of Samantha. And in this photo, Samantha looks kind of dazed, like she's got a blank expression, and she's not really looking at the camera, she's looking just to the side of the camera. And then in this picture, a man is holding a copy of the Anchorage Daily News newspaper that's dated February 13th, 2012. This was a proof of life photo where Samantha's captor was holding up that newspaper to indicate that Samantha was alive as of February 13th. And so to everybody involved in this case, including Samantha's father, even though this is still not a good situation at all, it was kind of a relief to know that at least as of last week, Samantha was alive. As for the demands of this ransom note, James was told to deposit $30,000 into his daughter's account immediately, and if he did that, she would be released 6 months later. As advised by the FBI, James deposited a portion of the ransom money into his daughter's account, and then the FBI just waited and watched, because they knew if anyone tried to withdraw money from that account, they could track where the card was. A few days later, 3 separate withdrawals were made within Anchorage, but each time the FBI got a notification about one of these withdrawals, they would rush to the scene, and whoever it was that had tried to make this withdrawal was long gone. When they pulled the security footage from these 3 different ATMs, the person that was making these withdrawals was a man wearing a ski mask and big sunglasses. so they had no way to identify him. After these withdrawals, the account went silent for over a week, and in that time, there was no word from Samantha. Then, on March 7th, more withdrawals were made, but they were in Arizona, and then New Mexico, and then in Texas. Again, authorities would rush to these ATMs, but they would get there right after the masked man with sunglasses had just left. But there was a break this time. In one of these surveillance videos from one of the Texas ATMs, they spotted the car this guy was getting into before he left. And it was a small sedan, it was a white Ford Focus, and they saw him leave going east on a Texas highway. And so authorities in Texas were told to look out for this particular car in this part of Texas. And sure enough, on March 13th, a Texas patrolman spotted the car sitting in a hotel parking lot. He waited nearby until a man in his 30s walked out of one of the hotel rooms, walked down and got inside the car, and then this patrolman just kind of followed him and looked for any reason to pull him over. And as he had his radar gun on this guy, he noticed he was going 2 miles per hour above the speed limit, and so he pulled him over. The patrolman got out, he walked up to the driver's side window, the window was already down, the man was very calm. The patrolman asked him for his license, and the guy handed him an Alaskan license. His name was Israel Keys, he was 34 years old, and he lived in Anchorage. The patrolman knew this was the guy. He called in backup, and before long they were searching Keys' car, and in the trunk they found a ski mask along with other clothes that matched the description of the guy who was making withdrawals from these different ATMs. They also found a gun, as well as Samantha's cell phone and debit card. After Keys was arrested and was brought into custody, he denied having any involvement with Samantha's disappearance. But after being presented with the overwhelming evidence that suggested otherwise, he caved and said yes, he would tell them the full story of what happened to Samantha, but they had to get him an Americano coffee, a peanut butter Snickers, and a cigar. Once he had said items, he began to speak. And what he said was so disturbing and so graphic, the FBI still has not released the full transcript of his confession. Here is the version of events based on what was made public. On February 1st, 2012, Keys decided he was going to rob the Common Grounds coffee kiosk. He walked up to the window expecting there to be some teenager working inside, and he was right. It was Samantha. He asked her for an Americano, and while she turned to make his drink, suddenly his plan changed. Not only was he going to steal money from inside of this coffee shop, he decided he was going to steal Samantha from this coffee shop. When she turned back with his drink and handed it to him, he discreetly pulled his gun out and aimed it at her and told her this was a robbery. That's when she backed up and put her hands up, and then she turned around, he tied her hands, he jumped back inside, and then he said after he shut the window, he jammed napkins inside of her mouth so she couldn't make any sound, and then he marched her out the door, outside, into his car, and they took off. Once they were in the vehicle, he pulled the napkins out of her mouth, and he told her if she tried to escape or if she tried to flag anybody down that he would just kill her. And so he said she was very obedient, she was obviously very scared, but she was trying to do her best to stay composed. At some point, Keys reached over and took her phone and sent that text message to her boyfriend informing him that she was going to be spending a couple of days with friends and that he should tell her father. And then Keys told Samantha he was going to be holding her hostage and trying to extract some ransom money. Samantha told Keys that her family was very poor and that he wouldn't get much money out of them, to which Keys said, "Don't worry about it, I know they'll raise money and they'll come up with it somehow." Then they drove around Anchorage for several hours, periodically stopping so Samantha could get out and relieve herself, other times so Keys could smoke a cigar. Then around midnight, Keys made his way back to his house and he pulled into the driveway and he turned to Samantha and he had her go in the back seat and lie down, and he put some tarps over her and he told her if she tried to escape, he would kill her. And then Keys got out and he walked inside of his house where his 10-year-old daughter and his girlfriend were fast asleep. And in just a few hours, Keys and his daughter were scheduled to go to New Orleans for a 2-week-long luxury cruise. Keys left his house and went back to his car. He put a blindfold on Samantha and then led her down the driveway to his shed. Once inside, he sat her down on an upturned bucket in the back of the shed, and then he put a rope around her neck and he anchored each end of the rope to the wall so she was pinned to the wall. Then Keys turned his radio all the way up to make sure it masked any noise she might make, even though he reminded her repeatedly that if she made any noise, he would just kill her, and by and large, she was very obedient. And then he gave her a couple of cigarettes to smoke and told her it was going to be just fine, to just chill out, that he was going to get the ransom money from their family, and then as soon as that was done, he would let her go. He turned on some space heaters to keep the space warm, and then he left and locked the door. He walked back into his house and double-checked that his daughter and his girlfriend were still asleep. They were. Afterwards, he started drinking some wine and relaxing, and then after a little while, he got a cup of water and he went back out to the shed. He went inside and he gave the water to Samantha, and he said Samantha was very composed. She was obviously frightened, but she asked him, "Did you speak to my father? Did you figure out the ransom situation?" And Keyes told her that, "Yes, I talked to your father. Everything's working out fine. He's going to raise the money. We're going to get you out of here. Everything's going exactly to plan." After that, he walked up to Samantha and he unscrewed the 2 anchors that were holding that rope up against her throat, and then he cut the zip ties on her wrist, allowing her to relax and sit forward and just kind of be at ease for a second. And it was very obvious that Samantha was relieved. Her nightmare was about to be over. But then seconds later, Keyes grabbed her really aggressively and tied her up all over again, this time much more thoroughly and much more tightly. It had been a cruel trick. When he cut her handcuffs and undid her necktie, he just wanted to see what she would do if she thought she was being let go. When in reality, he was never going to let her go. There was no ransom. He had not spoken to her father. It was all a big lie. Keyes told investigators that as he was tying her up for that second time, he looked at her face and she had this look of total resignation. He said she knew what was about to happen to her. After Keyes tied her up, he left the shed and locked it behind him. He went inside to check one more time to make sure his 10-year-old daughter and his girlfriend were still asleep. When they were, he went back to the shed, he opened it up, he went inside, and this time when he stepped inside, it smelled like urine and sweat, and he looked down at Samantha and she was terrified. He walked up to her and he began to assault her, and then after he was done, he was standing over her getting his clothes back on, and Samantha very stoically looks up at him and says, "Are you going to kill me?" And he says, "Yes, I am." As he put on his leather gloves, she tried to talk him out of it, but he said there was no other way. Keyes would tell investigators that he was very impressed with Samantha's bravery. Shortly before 4 a.m., Keyes drove a knife into Samantha's back before choking her until she stopped moving. He told investigators that she never made a sound. After she was dead, Keyes left the shed and locked it behind him. He went into his house, he took a shower. Afterwards, he woke up his daughter and told her to start getting ready because they were leaving soon for the airport. While his daughter was getting ready, Keyes went back out to the shed, he went inside, he rolled Samantha's body up in a tarp and pushed her towards the back. He unplugged the space heaters, turned off the lights, turned off the music, and then double locked the shed and went back inside the house to make his daughter breakfast. At 5 a.m., a cab showed up at the house and Keyes and his daughter hopped inside and they made their way to the airport and then on to New Orleans, where they went on their 2-week-long vacation. After they got back, Keyes went inside of his shed, he unrolled Samantha from her tarp, and by his account, she still looked fairly lively, and so he dressed her in some new clothes, he put lots of makeup on her face, he braided her hair, and then he stitched her eyelids open, so it gave the impression she was alive and alert, and then he held up a copy of the Anchorage Daily News next to her, and then took several photos, creating that proof of life photo for the ransom note. If you want to see this photo, you can Google it, but that's up to you. After he took these pictures, he chopped her body up into pieces and then disposed of her in a nearby frozen lake. It would turn out Samantha was not Israel Keyes' first victim. He was in fact a serial killer who specifically preyed on completely random people because he enjoyed watching them die. Over the years, he had hid what he called kill kits all over the United States, which were these caches filled with weapons and other tools designed to capture and kill people. This way, no matter where he was in the country, when he had an urge to go kill someone, he would just go to his nearest kill kit, dig it up, and then go target a random stranger. And he didn't care if you were young, old, big, small, male, female, alone, or in a group. Everyone was a target of opportunity. Keyes told investigators that as soon as he saw Samantha inside of that coffee kiosk, instantly he knew he was going to kill her. Everything about the ransom, the robbery, all of it was just a lie to keep her in line, to give her some hope that she might get out of this alive. When in reality, the second she walked outside of the doors of that kiosk, she was dead. Keyes admitted to killing Samantha as well as an older couple up in Vermont, but he would take his own life in a jail cell in December of 2012 before he named any of his other victims. And so to this day, we have no idea how many people he killed. The best guess is 11 based on a drawing he made in his jail cell, but that's just a guess. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please replace the like button's eye drops with Egyptian fox urine. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.